Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario's podcast, Aging Vibrantly, Conversations to Empower Seniors. I'm Raeann Rideout, the host of a show where we amplify the voices of seniors who impart their expertise and wisdom to enhance our understanding of aging issues and how to have a safe and fulfilling life with dignity and respect. We're going to talk about a variety of issues that affect all of us as we age. Today, I'm joined by April Struthers, an organizational consultant, social change agent, and author in the field of elder abuse prevention at WITWorks. Thank you so much for joining us today, April, for this enlightening conversation we're going to have on ageism. Our guest for our inaugural episode on Aging Vibrantly is Ashton Applewhite. Ashton is an internationally recognized expert on ageism, the author of This Chair Rocks and Manifesto Against Ageism, which is a great fun read, and co-author of the Old School Hub. Ashton, thank you for joining us today and for taking the time to speak to us about this important issue. Given our passion to ensure that all older adults and individuals age vibrantly, we are looking forward to our conversation about empowering older adults to dismantle ageism. So maybe we'll just dig right in and get started. So according to the World Health Organization, on a global scale, they indicate that 1 in 2 people are ageist, which is, remarkable. Like it's like a wow moment. Like our 50% of our population is ageist against older adults. It's kind of frightening when we think about that, and thinking that I thought maybe that would be less in terms of the percentage. And I'm sure our listeners today are shocked and have no idea how pervasive ageism is in our society. Did you get surprised, or did this information surprise you when it came to your attention?
Well, I'm laughing, not bitterly, because I would honestly put the figure at 100%. Because we are all biased. We're all, no matter how hard we work, not to be, not to have prejudice. We are all raised in, attitudes towards age, like attitudes towards race and gender, start to form in early childhood. And every culture has its values around those things. So we start out as blank slates, but in the West, we are indoctrinated, very early on with messages about how, aging is awful and is the same thing as becoming incapacitated, and how tragic it would be to encounter any incapacity, and so on. Starting with children's books, and Disney movies. So unless we stop to challenge those attitudes, they become part of our identity. That is internalized bias. And I don't think any of us, unless we, lived in a, island somewhere, and then we would be raised by people who would have their own attitudes about age and aging. So none of us are immune. The most important critical starting place is to look at our own attitudes towards age and aging, because you can't challenge something we're not aware of. I love pointing it out that this comes from the World Health Organization, not the World Old People Organization. Why? Because they realize that the biggest obstacle to extending health span, along with lifespan, the number of years in which we are in as good health as possible, was ageism, right? Not clean water, not influenza boosters, ageism. So that's a really impressive fact in and of itself. And one more thing. See, I wrote down the things you said so I'd remember them all. I'm very pleased with myself. You framed it, Raeann, as prejudice against older people. That's part of it. But the hashtag for the World Health Organization's campaign is a world for all ages. Older people absolutely bear the brunt of ageism because we live in a youth-obsessed world, but ageism is any judgment on the basis of age. And it can be you're too young for that, or young people, trying to get, heard in a meeting or get a job, and someone says, what could you possibly know? That's ageism too. It cuts both ways. And we are being ageist anytime we make an assumption about anyone, no matter their age, no matter our age, on the basis of how old we think they are.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we do talk, and the work that we do around youth and trying to have that conversation between both across all ages, because it's not just we don't want to segregate people, just youth and seniors, because it's everyone, right? And
it's a spectrum, absolutely. Yes. And so, by the way, is health. You know, we don't go from, no one's in perfect health. I mean, maybe like a newborn baby, right? But by, by the time we're in our 30s, we can't run as fast as we did when we were in our 20s. And it's not like, you have to run fast to be a success in the world. But it's just another one of those punishing binaries. We don't go from, healthy to sick. We don't go from mobile to immobile. We don't go from independent, right? And all those binaries are false.
Right.
I mean, we might go for those things, but not overnight. We don't wake up in the morning. People used to say, like, when does old begin? Well, it doesn't begin. Old looks different on me than it does to you. And some of the things that I miss, and, mostly in terms of physical function, you wouldn't notice, or vice versa.
That's true.
So you've already spoken to this a little bit, but we're just wondering, in terms of definitions of ageism, how do you define it?
Yeah. It's the dictionary definition is discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. That doesn't really get at the structural piece of it. Mm-hmm. I really like the way the World Health Organization framed the challenge ahead of us, which is to change, in an ageist world, to change how we think, feel, and act about age and aging, which is to say, to challenge our mainly negative, associations. And, the thinking piece gets to do with stereotypes, the feelings is prejudice, and the act is discrimination. So it's a complicated thing. And as I said, sort of the litmus test is, how do we think about age and aging? Do we make an assumption about someone on the basis of age? If a friend is seeing someone new, do you want to know how old they are? Of course you do. Admit it. We all do,
Yeah.
But that, and maybe there's, there's sometimes a legitimate reason, which is, if your friend wants to start a family, an age limit is real. If your friend is a mountaineer, they're going to have a hard time finding older people to do an extreme sport with. But we give age more credit than it deserves for shaping our tastes and our inclinations. So again, if we want to know that number, want to know how old someone is, think about why we want to know. Where does that itch come from, and what happens when we scratch it?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, you really hit the mark in terms of how hard it is to kind of surface this and then figure out what to do with it, in the fact that we need to think differently. We need to understand our own prejudices, our own biases, and then how we act towards others, and that we are othering folks when there's no need to it. And it's based on perception. It's based on assumptions. It's not actually fact-based per se.
No prejudice is rational. I mean, you could argue that ageism is especially irrational in that most of it, which is to say just prejudice and stigma around later life, is our own future older selves. And clearly it does not make any sense to discriminate against your own self, but no prejudice makes sense. No prejudice is rational. So it's always a mistake to compare one ism to another. And the way each of us experiences any form of bias or discrimination depends on, what we look like, how much money we have, how we grew up, all these, so each person's experience is unique. Although that reminds me of one other thing, that sometimes I think if I could put one fact about aging in everyone's head, it is that the nerdy way that social scientists say, the defining characteristic of later life is heterogeneity. The longer we live, the more different from one another we become. So if you go back to stereotypes, obviously not everyone born in Puerto Rico is the same. Obviously not everyone who is homosexual is the same. All stereotypes are foolish and wrong, but they are especially misguided when it comes to age, to later life, because the exact reverse is the case. We age at different rates, socially, physically, cognitively. And as we go through life, shaped by our unique set of experiences, we become more different from each other.
And it's unfortunate that we do group people together because we just, you lose, like you say, that individuality and the uniqueness of each individual. And which I think is, it is a detriment to individuals as we age.
In any domain, in
exactly.
any enterprise.
Yeah. I just want to just go back to, you were talking about the isms, when we were talking about racism and sexism. But ageism is the most tolerated form of discrimination. And, why is that? Obviously, we're not seeing aging or the aging population as important in our society. And how do, we're going to talk a little bit further about this later, but how do we shift that conversation to be a priority and the work that we are doing and why we're having these important conversations today? Because it's not given the profile or it's changing, I have to admit. In the last 5 years or more, we have made significant headway. But why are we continuing to, still knock on doors to get people to start paying attention to their older population when, in fact, we know the population is aging? It's not a surprise. It's, we know these demographics trends that have been happening, and our population is, outnumbering their youth at this point, I know in Canada. So, how can we give this a higher profile in society in the work that we do?
I mean, you are doing it. You are doing it by hosting this podcast. You are doing it by talking about it with your friends and with your colleagues and in your community. So, social change is slow and hard, and it can really feel overwhelming, but it is really important to look around and to acknowledge the progress that we have made. I mean, think how no one disagrees with this. I always am careful to think like, gee, am I looking for the answer I hope for? But I think there is no doubt that awareness of ageism has hugely increased over the last few years with the World Health Organization campaign, with the whole appallingly ageist and ableist brouhaha around the age of presidential candidates in the US, et cetera, et cetera. And the first step in any of this is awareness. 2 weeks ago, on Wednesday, the 19th, October 19th, was Ageism Awareness Day. We can't challenge bias unless we're aware of it. That started out as an idea in Australia only 4 years ago. And Australia launched, not coincidentally, 4 years before that, 4 or 5, because I went on a tour of Australia for it. It was so great. They launched Every Age Counts, the first national anti-ageism campaign. There's still tons of ageism in Australia, but there are more little actions coming out of Australia than anywhere else because that campaign planted the seeds. Then they said, let's make it Ageism Awareness Day. 2 years later, the American Society on Aging in the US got on board. This year, Help Age International got on board. The Canadian Association Against Ageism got on board. That is rapid proliferation. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that change is happening, and also that any action, no matter how small, helps move the needle. Even if, and that's the hardest part, you look at your own attitudes towards age and aging, it's no fun to realize that you're biased. But honestly, that nothing happens unless we take that awkward, vulnerable, unpleasant step. But it's like letting a genie out of a bottle, because once you see it in yourself, you start to see it automatically in the culture around you. I see you nodding, April, right? It's like, oh, there are no old people in this TV show. Everyone in this billboard is 8. The way what that late show talk show host said about older people is appalling, right? Then once we see it around us, we become aware that it's not that we're bad people or we're deficient. It is embedded in the social and economic structures around us. And that means we can come together and do something about it.
Right. Yeah.
And that leads me to a couple of thoughts. One of them is to sort of ally with your saying that we can do something and it needs to be small and we need to keep doing it. I have the drip 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 theory of social change. Do the smallest significant thing you can, and then do it again, and then do it again, and put it on a bumper sticker and hang it on your fridge, what it is that you are doing and why. And actually, that idea of doing something really small in a way is empowering and enabling, because we're not asking people to change the world, whatever we think that is. We're saying change one of your habits, one of your tiny habits.
But you are changing the world when you take that awareness out into the world.
And just to kind of follow up on that, and I know you think about this all the time, and in our conversation so far, you've mentioned it a number of times, but using terminology around aging, and we struggled with that a bit for this podcast series. The tagline for the podcast is Conversations to Empower Seniors, but we were trying to pick out a word that described aging, or making sure that the appropriate age demographic knew from our title what we're talking about. And we're trying to be inclusive without wanting to be ageist. But we think about this all the time, and we had a struggle to figure out how to phrase that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Because words that should be neutral are not. Old should not be a dirty word. People shouldn't, we wouldn't, in a less ageist world, you wouldn't have, octogenarians going, I'm not old, as though it was contagious and as though it was the most awful thing in the world. So, it's all part. I mean, one of the starting places for sort of this little sort of letting the genie out of the bottle is to think about how we use the words old and young. People say, I don't feel old. What they mean is, I don't feel invisible. I don't feel useless. I don't feel unattractive. Well, I don't know about you, but I felt all those things worse at 13. I just happened to get a whole bunch of photographs from college days because my college classmate died. So there was this big sentimental outpouring. And man, I look at this unformed creature and I think I was sure I was fat. I was sure I was ugly. I surely didn't know what to be when I grew up. Not that I ever solved that one. But, I felt all those things actually worse. I felt better by the time I was in college than I did when I was 13. But the way those things are not yoked to age any more than, being old is inherently linked to being incapable or incompetent, right? That's, kids forget things too all the time, right? So is to decouple really to try to stop using the words young and old and use the actual feeling. I feel so old. What does old feel like? Yeah. Sometimes it feels great. Sometimes it feels crappy, but that depends on the moment. Depends on whether I've moved around enough so my arthritis doesn't hurt. Depends on whether I got offered a good gig. It depends on what I had for breakfast, just like it does for everybody else.
Yeah, it's so true. And, we see it happen, it shows up everywhere in our society around
everywhere.
Ageism is, yep, go ahead.
I didn't answer your first question, to which I'll provide a short answer about it being the most tolerated. I used to say that, you see, most acceptable form of prejudice. I stopped saying that sort of in the wake of Black Lives Matter, because honestly, they're all too tolerated. And I know you know that. I hope I don't sound finger waggy, but it's like, wait. I don't think it is the most tolerated. I could even make a case that ableism, which is prejudice and stigma around physical and mental function, which links so deeply to the issue of elder abuse, is even more tolerated. But I will say that it is the least examined, right? It's the one we haven't thought about. And the bad part of that is, of course, as we've already said, you got to know something is out there to realize it's a problem. But it also makes what we're doing, sometimes I say it's like cleaning a really dirty window. You can see where you've been. The aha moments are a dime a dozen, right? People don't talk about age and aging. We think we don't want to, but if you make it possible, I never thought I'd be a public speaker. I became one by accident. My cousin used to organize a wonderful performing arts festival every summer. And she used to hear me in the early days. I just did not know all these things I was learning. She picked a theme every year and she'd listen to me whine every summer. So she said, okay, the theme for this year is aging, and I want you to do an opening monologue. And that became the basis of my very first talk. The punchline, all her friends in the dramatic community were like, oh my God, don't pick aging. Like, ooh, ick, no one's going to want it. She told her subscriber base, we are hungry for this conversation, especially if we reframe aging. And this is part of the, one of the fun parts of the job ahead. Aging is not something sad that old people do. We're aging from the minute we are born. It is how we move through life. And that is another thing for a generalist like me that makes it so interesting. And we can see where we've been.
In this inaugural episode, we were joined with our guest Ashton Applewhite for a lively discussion on ageism. We covered a lot of ground in part one of this series on ageism. Ashton imparted her insights on defining ageism, its prevalence, impact, and where it shows up in our lives, from health, policy, and intergenerational dialogue. We learned to check our own assumptions and do some self-reflection on our own internal ageism. Ashton informed us of the challenges that lie ahead and how we think, feel, and act toward aging to challenge negative associations. She spoke about her work along with many organizations, seniors, and advocates around the world who are involved in creating a social change movement to dismantle ageism and embrace a world of all ages. And ending part one of our episode, she shared success stories of ageism campaigns, including Ageism Awareness Day, that are growing the conversation and resulting in positive changes. So join us back here on December 9th for part two of our ageism episode with Ashton Applewhite, where we dive into how we internalize ageism, explore the connection between ageism and elder abuse, and how we can encourage more intergenerational conversations on ageism. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to like, share, and rate the podcast and leave us a review of your feedback. It really does matter to us. Your likes and shares and reviews help us grow and increase our rankings so others can find the Aging Vibrantly podcast. This podcast is funded by the Government of Canada's New Horizons for Seniors program. The podcast is produced and edited by Todd Miller of the Podcast Experts with the support of Lisa Whitfield, a project coordinator. Until next time, stay vibrant.